Palingenesis by Simon Harewood. Book 3, Heart of the Sear. Chapter 6, Unmasked. Ranald of Arran lifted a hand to his brow, shielding his eyes from the afternoon sun. He was tired. The swiftness required during the pursuit of the Amul had allowed little time for rest. Yet the aches in his body brought their own odd comfort, the testimony of a great achievement. The extreme exertions of the past 10 days had brought deliverance to his realm and victory to his people. A threat such as had not existed since the early days, when Arran had barely been birthed, would trouble them no more. There was a shout further down the column, breaking in on his pensive state. A messenger hurried towards him, accompanied by 2 of his guards. He waited for them till they caught up. It was a scout, part of a group he had sent to the coast to make contact with Evrain. The man bowed low. Ranald motioned to him to report.
The fleet lies at Kiel, sire, awaiting your orders. Captain Evrain sends his compliments and wishes to inform you that the storm accounted for those enemy vessels we failed to capture. He has close to 4,000 prisoners on board.
Ranald thanked the scout and dispatched him back to Evrain with a message not to move from Kiel, but to await the king's arrival there. 4,000 more. Their pursuit had been all too successful. With Evrain's contribution, more than 10,000 Amul were in Aranite hands. That made many mouths to feed. For a moment he wondered whether it would have been better just to let them escape. Yet he could not risk allowing the Amul to reform in the south and to make another attempt. If they were strong enough still to force the Giri into another alliance, it could mean renewed hostilities. The prisoners would have to remain in Arran until an accord could be reached in the south. They would be put to work on the roads and in the fields, or to rebuild the looted towns. He was for the coast and Evrain's ships. These would afford a quicker passage to Arran Rock. Besides, he was tired of traversing the length and breadth of Arran on foot. Evrain would make a welcome addition to the party. Eald of Westmarch would watch the south and handle the prisoners. Evrain's contact with the Viran made him invaluable. Ranald would also need a good counselor to aid him in dealing with the Inrathians and their enigmatic master. He was not convinced that the worst of the storm that had fallen on the shores of the inland sea was over as yet. Kiel seemed peaceful enough in the early morning sun. Despite the warships lying at anchor in the bay, Ranald's party joined the coastal road south of Mirren. 2 more hours steady marching brought them into the town proper. The king was relieved to reach the sea and the vessels of his fleet at last. The long march was over for now. Evrain's men gave them a triumphant welcome. There was much congratulating on both sides. Honors were abundant and readily bestowed. A feast was held in commemoration of the victory, and, modest though it had to be, cheered the weary men of Arran. That afternoon they took ship for the Rock, leaving the captive Amul behind, to be marched southwards to join the main encampment. Eald had been advised to split them up as soon as possible. Some would go to Greenmere for rebuilding, others to Sunderend and the hamlets on the shore, even more to work the fields of the West March. Ranald stood on the deck of his flagship, watching the line of vessels running before the fresh breeze. They were making good time and would gain the rock perhaps by sunset of the next day. His small war fleet had proved invaluable, especially in the expert hands of his sea captain, Evrain. If it had not been for his cousin's efforts, the Inrathians would not have been able to make such an impact on the fighting in Arran, nor would the Amul attack on the rock have been turned into such a massive defeat. He turned to the man standing at a respectful distance behind him. Ranald motioned Evrain forward to join him at the rail. He spoke into the wind, his gaze fixed again on the line of sails.
We have come of age in this affair, Evrain. We have proven our abilities and resolve on land and sea. Even if ultimately we are brought low, we know now what we are made of.
Evrain smiled at his cousin, nodding.
We have been fortunate in many things. The timely warnings, the gallant allies, and the good sense of our king.
A little frown appeared on Ranald's brow.
Speaking of allies, tell me what you think of these Inrathians.
Evrain stared out at the dark sails of the 5 foreign vessels in his fleet. He thought back on the action of the last 10 days, recalling the first time he had seen these strange ships.
They have amazing ability to arrive exactly when needed. In the fight with the Sea Ravens, this ship we stand on would undoubtedly have been lost, were it not for the appearance of the Inrathian vessels, though empty and powerless to aid us. The enemy had not the heart to put their ruse to the test. During the pursuit of the last few days also they have shown their skill. Often I had the impression that they were waiting for our slower ships to catch up.
Ranald seemed to consider this in silence. At length he replied,
I saw similar things on the field of battle. Had they not arrived at the Black River exactly when they did, that victory could have been compromised or even reversed. This advantage comes from the old man, Lord Karth, whose supposed sorceries are well known to the spinners of rhyme-song tales. But I have seen his men on the field of battle.
Ranald's voice trailed off. He saw again the impossible advance of the black shields across the river, the spearheads slicing through the ranks of the Amul. It had been more than brute force, more than honed skill that broke the lines that day.
They are good warriors, no doubt, but their strength comes from the band he keeps about him, the Viron. These fight as no Nurian I've ever encountered. They strike like the men of legend, with powers beyond the command of mortals. Even in Arran town, the way they drove the enemy before them, it was something to see.
The king turned to face Evrain.
Would it be wise to support an alliance with such as these? How can we be sure of their intentions?
Evrain considered this for a while before replying. All his life the Viron had been a deadly enemy. They were painted as treacherous and malicious, their history steeped in betrayal and sorcery. He had fought against the Shining Blades from across the pass and their hillmen subjects several times. There had been disappointment at his first encounter with them, a lack of that unusual quality he had so greatly anticipated. Apart from the shining weapons and skills to match, there was no more stuff of legend, no deeds to elevate them above the level of men. Yet the Viron from Heron Inrath seemed to be of a different breed. Among them the old ways were alive still. Did they then also carry the traits of their forebears? Were they as treacherous and insidious? Yet they had proven their resolve in the fight against Malik Julian's alliance. Not only had they warned Arran of the impending invasion, but had thrown themselves wholeheartedly into the war. There was no doubting their commitment. There was no doubting Malik's bitter hostility and aggression.
I believe we are indebted to them already, to such a degree that our fates have become intertwined.
He thought suddenly of Gareth. How that Viron child had opened the doors of his prison. A trust had been earned and never betrayed.
The Inrathians have chosen to aid us, perhaps saved us from annihilation or slavery. They have thrown in their lot with us. It could be that they have earned the right to our trust.
Ranald sighed deeply.
If I see it that way, Evrain, I would that I could speak it as openly as you do now. It is such a pity that more men from Arran may not share your thoughts.
Evrain frowned.
Could there be doubt in any man's mind? After what we witnessed at the Rock,
The king nodded in agreement.
The Battle of Aaron Rock is our strongest argument. There, Malik's intentions were made plain, also the magnitude of his relentless plotting. The Southland attack was not merely meant as a diversion, it was aimed at overthrowing us entirely, to bring us into subjection to his will. If he is not ultimately defeated, our kingdom will not remain independent for long.
In the eastern woodlands of Estium, the men of Nemona remained in their hidden encampments. From time to time, they would venture out to the farmlands or the town for supplies and news. No one trusted the sudden calm following Turic's inexplicable withdrawal. By now, the reputation of the usurper was such that one expected treachery and deceit. The false count's present action was certainly a ruse to lure them from their forest hideout and destroy them in detail. 3 days passed in eerie silence before the scouts reported activity among the rolling hills. A host of some sort was making its way swiftly into the eastern heartland. Refugees reported hundreds of nightmarish creatures overrunning farmsteads and hamlets, destroying everything in their path. Puzzlement was gradually replaced by alarm as more and more reports filtered in. The men readied themselves to venture out. Even if Turic had some hand in this fiendish scheme, there was little choice but to face the approaching threat. The bands of marauders would find little to resist them in the town of Nemona. As it turned out, their initial hesitation almost cost them the lives of the unprotected families in town. On the march, they were met by frantic messengers calling them back to Nemona. Foul beasts were on the outskirts and closing in unopposed. People had locked themselves in their cellars or fled to the temple for refuge. The men rushed forward with all haste and came upon the strange spectacle, creatures of legend descending upon their homes. A savage clash ensued, the Estians fighting for their lives and those of their families. There was no reasoning with these beasts, no agreement that could be reached. The invaders had to be destroyed utterly. Men fought with a ferocity born of desperation, without a plan of battle or a tactical formation. That they prevailed in the end was due simply to the lack of numbers on the side of the invaders. Even so, the losses among the men of Nemona were great, and the injured outnumbered the sound. If Turic returned now, he would find the town defenseless and the inhabitants completely at his mercy. A mere day after the terrible encounter, 2 scouts arrived from the west. They served the king, they claimed, Tregoran, who was alive still in the city of Amrys. The tale of horror they told beggared belief. Soon enough, the good folks of Nemona realized they had but witnessed a tiny ripple of the great flood descending on Ligurium. The traitorous Count Turic would be hard-pressed by these happenings. The wounded might risk remaining within their town for the present. Messengers went back to the king, assuring him of their continued loyalty. Amid the monumental confusion of the last several seasons, Tregoran remained their one source of stability. Malvor faced his recruits across the inner courtyard of the ducal palace in Amrys. They were a motley array of artisans, farmers, dockside vagabonds, and merchants. Not with all the will in Myrol, and 2 seasons for the task, could he make them into anything resembling a fighting force. There were weapons enough, but the skill and resolve were sorely lacking. Most of these soldiers would simply get in the way during a conflict. Going through the motions of training them at least had a good effect on morale. Instead of sitting about in corners, bewailing their lot to their fellows, the wretches were occupied in constructive endeavors during the day and guard duties at night. It also gave him something with which to while away the time till his scouts returned. The men finished their drills in the half-hearted manner he had come to expect. He was about to berate them in the strongest terms when he spotted a messenger hurrying through the gateway. Leaving the clumsy bunglers to Fabian, he strode over to where the man awaited him among the columns. Malvor held up a hand when the scout was about to address him. He motioned the man inside with his eyes. Whatever intelligence he brought was not to be made known to everyone as yet. Once they were out of earshot, he was ready to receive the tidings.
What news from the west?
The Swarmlings are well to the north of Aruis on the coast. We believe they could have reached Varus by now. Their numbers are dwindling. The signs of their passing indicates that, as well as the numbers slain during the attacks on the city. They tend to follow the main roads, with small groups splintering off now and then to assault farms and small settlements. There is doubt whether there are sufficient numbers to breach the walls of Varus. Malvor considered this for a moment. The western branch of the swarm was petering out. If the strong city of Varus could be saved, a little of Ligurium would survive. The farmland of the interior and the surroundings of Pronacum might also remain relatively unscathed. He wondered how the Easterlands were faring. The scout continued. The Sea Ravens have been looting the city of Aruis for days. It seems that they were waiting for the creatures to depart. We believe they may plunder all the coastal towns up to Nuria, including Varus. There are very few fighting men remaining there. Malvor nodded in agreement. The vultures from Trax Isles would lose no time in swooping down on their helpless neighbors. Their disgusting greed and cowardice had brought them into the struggle on the side of who they perceived to be the strongest. He was not really surprised by this. The scout was dismissed to grab a much-needed meal and a good night's rest before returning to his companions on the coast. Malvor went back to the council room by himself. Lining one of the walls was a trestle table, on which the largest map of the inland sea region he could find had been spread out. Whatever information was brought in by the scouts was added by moving about the objects representing threats and enemies, drinking cups, inkwells, or coins, anything that came to hand. Carefully he adjusted the copper coins on the coast to surround Varus. These represented the swarm. He removed one coin to indicate the diminishing numbers. Then he moved another inland to attack the farms. 3 remained. There was movement behind him. He spun round as someone came into the room. It was the princess, smiling at his raised eyebrows and slightly startled expression. She looked quite the picture in a dark green velvety gown, her hair neatly caught in a net. Haldred had seen the messenger arrive, and knew she would find the captain in here, scheming over his map.
I'm sorry,
she said.
One should not creep up on people in nervous times like these.
He returned her smile. Something of the princess had been rekindled in her demeanor and appearance.
No matter. I was lost in contemplation, that's all.
Not too grave, I hope, for all our sake.
She came to stand next to him. Malvor could not resist a comment.
Permit me to say that the color of your gown suits you well. The garments you arrived in were a little travel-worn.
She actually laughed.
Oh, some of the old things stayed behind here when we moved to Brick. It feels good to have more than one change of clothes again. I would rather not think of the mire through which I was dragged in those travel-worn rags.
Her eyes moved over the disposition of the objects on the map. She noted the change.
What news, then?
He pointed to the coins.
Varus is invested by the swarm, though the latter has lost much of its potency. You can begin to appreciate what you did in the waste. With greater numbers, the city would stand no chance at all.
She took in her breath, staring at him.
You mean they could hold the scourge there?
I would not give you false hope. The scouts believed it possible, judging by the reduced size of the force. Yet...
He hesitated and cleared his throat. Reaching forward, Melvor moved the inkwell off the coast at Arus to Varus.
The sea ravens are closing in to loot that city also. The good people may beat off the swarm just to be enslaved by these rogues.
Aldred fixed her eyes on the dark object. She was shaking her head.
One would expect it of the carrion crows, but better enslaved than devoured. If Malekulian could be stopped, there might be a chance of bringing them back.
They fell silent, considering the possibility. If he could be stopped. Who was to stop him? Could Nuria, with its strength mustered in time, even outlive the swarm? Asar had painted them a picture of what Malik was assembling in the south. The ravens could very well get to keep what they took on the coast of Ligerium. Aldred's gaze settled on the piles of coins Melvor had placed on store.
How many hundreds per coin?
She asked.
10. 1 coin is 1,000 swarmlings. It is an estimate only, of course.
He pointed to the roadway snaking inland from store, then traced another route leading westwards to Ingerval and the shore.
The swarm will split again here at store. Every time it divides like that, the main force weakens considerably. If Turek marched north to join with Fengor, and they made use of the river, the scourge might have been stopped here.
Again he pressed his finger on the map at store.
If not, it will be much weakened after the storming of the city.
Haldred stared at the stacks of coins. She remembered Melvor's description of the scourge surrounding Breck like the waves of the ocean. The ranks would be thinned out now. There was hope. The same burning that had started in her in the darkening, deep in the caves at Frane's Point, at the sight of a bloated body slowly turning over in the black water. 1 in 6, perhaps, of these foul beasts had not survived to reach the lands of Ligerium and Nuria. What they had achieved in the waste was an awesome victory. Their gaze swept the map, moving southwards to Tirallen. In his swampland stronghold, Malik was waiting to pounce on his dismayed enemies. Involuntarily, her thoughts went to Rune. He had traveled that realm, had witnessed some of the devices of the Marsh King. Even though he had not been convinced then, there was still the warning he had given her to flee the city of Breck and remove her family far to the east. Had he suspected anything of what was to unfold thereafter? It had to be. Where was he now in the madness and turmoil? She stared down at the map as if it could reveal Rune's location to her. A strange feeling stole over her. In an inexplicable way, she believed the apathy and hatred that was his shield had been swept away. He had chosen sides. And there was no real question as to which side he was on. His nature would not let him side with the sea ravens in this struggle. She smiled to herself. Not that Malik's hatred for Nurians would have allowed Rune a place in his realm after all. There was another possibility that seemed more obvious and much less appealing. Rune could have taken his own advice and traveled into the east. He could be far away by now, well out of danger, enjoying his indirect revenge. All those who had done him harm would be swept away. Would it be such a terrible thing to do as he had? Could she not find him somewhere in the unknown lands and feel that gratitude again, that deep sense of fulfillment that their few sincere words had engendered in him once? The silence had lengthened. Melvor cleared his throat, bringing her back to the present.
As soon as we receive intelligence from the south and east, we will be able to decide where to go.
Haldred gained a little color. How could she think of her future at a time like this? She was still the daydreaming girl of Arewis. She glanced up at Melvor. Had he surmised something of her train of thought? It did not matter. He already suspected her, she was sure. After that embarrassing moment outside Breck, when she had mistaken him for his countryman, there was no hiding her silly expectation.
Where could we go in Malik's world? Do you think Hekan Sear would take me back into his collection? If Nuria falls, there will be only a few deserted cities for the vultures to squabble over.
That is the truth.
Melvor brought a hand up to his chin.
And that is why I need to get back there. Wherever you decide to go, my decision is made already. There is no other place for a soldier right now than where the battle will be set.
Aldred looked at him in understanding. Had she not rushed back to Amherst in the hope of aiding those for whom she cared? Malvor still had the hope she had already lost. Ligerium was overrun. Nuria might be saved.
You would go north even if Nuria has already fallen?
He nodded.
I would, in the hope of doing what we have done here, taking out the few who survive.
In solemn silence they surveyed the map, the stacks of coppers, the goblet of silver in the marshland, its threat at once unfathomable and potent. Malvor spoke at length, his voice on the verge of breaking.
We have no answer for this. We are caught in the dark, betrayed, helpless. You are right, there's no denying it. Without the Ark there can be no victory against this evil.
Haldred reached out to touch his arm.
You could not have known. None of us did.
He seemed not to hear her.
All my life I have fought against it. I believed. The Questers I trusted. Talon. I took sides, made my decisions blindly, sacrificed. Oh.
His eyes widened. He stared in horror beyond the walls of the room, back through the hard, empty cycles. He tried to continue, but his breath caught in his throat. A choking cry escaped him.
Oh, I sacrificed Garrett. I sacrificed my son to support their lies. And see what it has come to. See how I am to pay for it now.
He swept his hand across the map.
I am to watch it all torn apart, and stand powerless all the while.
He recomposed himself with an effort.
Forgive me.
Haldred responded quickly.
We all have our regrets. I was warned. I was told in so many words what would take place. My doubt and hesitation brought me to this place. With the deaths of thousands about me. Have you seen my father? Have you seen the great sorrow that will never fade, weighing him down? We have to bear it now. It is our burden. And perhaps spend what time and resources we have in a small effort to atone.
He nodded slowly, not meeting her eyes.
I need to find some air.
Slowly he moved to the doorway. Just before passing through, he turned back to her.
Join me for a walk?
They made their way into the light, among the stone columns, through the courtyard and out to the palace garden. The Genesis sun was low in the sky, warm and comforting, a promise. Flowers, floating on long stems, still strove among the trampled beds. The air was permeated with their aroma, the lazy business of flying insects, painted golden in the sun, a blanket of bird-song. In such a place even the signs of violence lost their potency to impress. Thoughts of war ought to be far distant. Haldred found a bench in the shade. He smiled weakly at her as she pulled him towards it. The garden was working its magic. Her mind sprouted memories of another garden in a faraway palace.
Tell me about Prince Rune. Is he really the criminal he was made out to be?
Malvor did not even look surprised at the sudden question. He folded his arms and stretched out his legs. His eyes were fixed on the tips of his boots.
I hardly know what to say. I believed it all the time. He was a fiend in my eyes, a traitor to his king and his kind. But Fengor's actions in Lythan showed him capable of these very qualities. He is not trustworthy when dealing with those he regards as underlings. Now, of course, I know the Questers are capable of the same. Is it true? Who can tell? Did you ask it of him?
She nodded, smiling at the memory.
In a way. He did not answer directly, but I knew from his response that he is innocent at least of the murder. Don't ask me how, but I'm certain of it.
You trust him completely.
I do. I did. Who knows where he is now? Would he care if I'm alive or not?
Haldred laughed softly.
You must think me a complete fool.
Malvor shrugged.
You are in good company, then. Here we are all complete fools.
Captain Railf smiled to himself as the town walls of Rosfarron came into view. What a bargain he had struck! Earl Wayne had been left with a mess to clean up, and he was on campaign again, ready to strike down the enemies of Arryn. No doubt the good Earl would be sitting at table tonight in the Rock, wringing his hands with the thought of another gaining the glory in his place. Well, if one always looked to one's comfort. Not that organizing the overturned anthill on the coast would be an easy task. Railf infinitely preferred the decisive action of an offensive. Everything was structured and sure, the forces at his disposal, the objective, the strategy to ensure success. He reveled in it. Railf halted his 20 hundreds in a ravine 2 miles from the city. His scouts had reported a loose cordon of mountsmen no more than a mile distant. They were watching the road south for a relieving force. These unfortunates could have no idea as yet of the great triumph of Arrynite arms at the Rock, or they would have taken to their heels already. After their failed attempt at carrying the walls of the town, the rebel clans under Yennig had grudgingly settled down to a siege of sorts, or rather a blockade, for no further attempts were made to breach the defenses. The easy prize they had sought had eluded them. In reality, the rabble from the hills had little stomach for an extended fight. Already some had slipped away in 2s and 3s to return home or go on a prolonged hunting trip. It might be more expedient to pillage lone farmsteads instead of the town bristling with arms. Yes, they lingered here still, thought Railf, and now they would pay the price for their treason, for their failure and their foolish persistence. The Arrynites would encircle the besiegers. Half Rail's force would work their way to the north round the enemy positions. If the moundsmen decided on a hasty retreat, which was probable in his estimation, they would find their way of escape blocked. There would be no option but to surrender or be annihilated. The rebellion had to end here. As soon as they had taken up their positions, his men would rest during the darkness and be ready to strike before first light. It was a simple enough operation. He would not bother informing the defenders of the city of what was about to transpire. He did not need their help after all. The silver stars stared down on the dark ocean, as if each sought its own reflection among the innumerable ripples. Everrain's ships glided into port under a gentle breeze, slipping through the inky water almost without a sound. Golden lights waited for them along the shore, despite the late hour, and a cheer went up when the king was spotted on deck, enough to wake all the sleepers in Arryn Town. It was an hour of victory, a day of triumph, and the joy of it had taken root in the hearts of all men. Soon the streets thronged with arriving sailors and resident soldiers. The welcome was warm for comrades in arms who had not fainted and faced the overwhelming force of the enemy with them. Cooking fires were lit again, and no one thought of sleep. No one but the king and his captain, who slowly worked their way through the crowds, over the causeway to the Rock. The morning would bring new challenges that would best be handled with a clear mind and rested body. To their surprise, it was Earl Wayne who greeted them at the doorway to the great hall. Everin shook his head silently when he explained to them the persistent bargaining of Railf that had sent him north instead of the Earl. There was no doubt that the good captain was up to the task. It was not surprising either that he would want to lead an attack after the desperate defensive struggle at the Rock. Everin had his own ideas, which he kept to himself. Railf needed to be active at this time, with the memory of his great loss still fresh in his mind. Perhaps it was good that he could find this outlet for his grief and anger just now. Ranald and Everin both refused refreshment, citing the fatigue of their long journey. What they needed most urgently was rest. Reports and accounts would have to wait till daylight. For now it was sufficient that they had arrived safe and sound. Railf had 20 of his archers send up blazing arrows. He watched them reach up into the early morning sky, the curve of their trajectory, the dip towards the ground. There would be no chance of his northern sentries not being warned and ready. The semi-circular formation was spread over a mile, its center on the road, 100 of the swiftest men on each flank. These moved off first, to close the trap and prevent the enemy from escaping towards the sea or westwards over the meadows. The rest of the men stood watching him, eager, prepared. Raelf drew his sword and gave the command to advance. Quickly it was repeated down the line, and the entire formation stepped forward in unison, clouds of streaming breath forming in the cold morning air above them. For a while there was no sound but the tramping feet and the occasional shouted instruction from a sergeant. Soon enough they encountered the first pickets. The sleepy moundsmen fled at the sight of the advancing soldiers, shouting the alarm as they went. Raelf watched them go, his sword hand itching. He fervently hoped there would be at least some resistance before the day was over. There was no glory in defeating an enemy who had no stomach to stand and fight. He underestimated the hatred and resolve of the clans, however. Yenig, chieftain of the combined forces of the Tyndall, had entered upon a course of confrontation and revenge, and there was no turning back. All the chiefs had taken the oath of blood, and would be branded traitors and cowards if they backed down. Rost, the strange man of Yenig's clan, had spread the rumor that deserters would be caught and used in the renewal rituals at the next darkening. Everyone knew enough about his reputation to realize this was no bluff. The moundsmen themselves, unaware of the Aronite triumph, still held to the promise of plunder and vengeance on their oppressors. As the fleeing enemy moved away from them, Raelf's hundreds quickened their pace. He was eager not to allow the enemy an escape. The formations lost their solidity as the men hastened forward in the half-dark. Soon the advancing line resembled the loose groupings of a charge. The enemy fell back before them. They overran campsites and cooking fires burning still. The ragged advance broke up into pockets, chasing down the unseen moundsmen. Yenig had had time enough to consider a course of action against an Aronite relieving force, though he had not expected one to arrive so soon. Rost had assured him that the barbarian invasion would keep the armies of Aron occupied for seasons, at least till Suntide. This assault had to be a desperate effort from old Raelf at the rock. The moundsmen moved swiftly, concentrating their forces to the west. Here they halted, waiting for the warriors from the northern section to arrive. With all their men in one location, they would be able to break the line of attack and throw their assailants into confusion. It was common knowledge that the Aronites loved their tight formations and fancy tactics. Fighting in disrupted conditions never suited them. Raelf's long battle line was approaching the city wall when the first enemy missiles fell among them. In the early light it was difficult to determine where the arrows were coming from. Soon enough the sounds of clashing arms echoed down from his left flank. Voices rose in cries of war and anguish. The fight was on at last. Still he pressed forward, unaware of the enemy's exact location. Watchfires were lit on the barricades of the city defenses. Somewhere a trumpet sounded. Immediately Raelf saw the danger of his position. Would the town's defenders loose their arrows at the approaching host? Would they be able to tell the difference between friend and foe in the semi-dark? At last he halted his charging men and ordered the trumpeters to sound. This should convince the men of Rasfarin that help had arrived. He looked up at the pale eastern horizon, willing the sun to rise. His hope to surprise the enemy had not materialized. To the northwest his line was crumbling, outflanked and temporarily outnumbered by the Tyndall. The enemy was fighting with a courage born of desperation, in conditions they preferred. The fine-trained men of Aron were striving against them in small groups with no order or structure, falling in twos and threes and dozens, till finally they broke and surged southwards in a confused mass. Captain Raelf saw his attack going awry and swore under his breath. The sun touched the rim of the world with a golden fingertip. To the west he saw the advancing Tyndall, the melting Aronites, the unfolding disaster. He set his teeth and ground out his orders. The trumpet sounded the left wheel on the standard. The chaotic milling ceased. The remaining hundreds regrouped, facing westwards. Shields came up. Spears straightened out in the same direction. The archers formed up in the rear to loose their shafts in unison. The advancing moundsmen saw the shield wall and faltered. They brought forward their bowmen, while they stood about in little clumps of uncertainty. A great shout went up from the Aranite ranks, and they advanced as one, the morning dew on their armor glistening in the sunlight. The Tyndall chieftains arrived to encourage their men. Soon a battle line formed, and the chants and war songs rose up among the warriors. Already they had tasted blood. Many enemies were dead or dying on the ground. If they could but break the wall of shields coming towards them, the day could be theirs. The boasting started, the claims on the head of the commander, the breaching of the wall. They hurled their insults towards the approaching enemy like stones from a sling. And then, in a fever of rage and fear, they charged. Raelf watched them come with grim resolution. Half his force was yet to appear on the field of battle. What they had encountered in the north to delay them he had no idea. 2 of his hundreds had been chewed up in the confused fighting of earlier. If the enemy madmen could penetrate the wall, it would be a close thing. The wild charge slammed into the tightly packed shields, pushing back the Aranites a few paces before grinding to a halt. Only for a moment the issue hung in the balance. When the assault failed to pierce through the armored wall, the roundsmen found themselves at a disadvantage. Slowly they lost ground as warriors went down to the long spears of Aaron. Bravely, frantically, they strove to beat back the shields. It could not last. Above the screaming and clamor rose a trumpet sound behind the Tyndall lines. Raelf's reinforcements had arrived from the north and were forming their ranks for an assault. With enemies on both sides, and no headway to be made against the shield wall, the warriors broke and ran, desperate to escape what could only be their complete destruction. Even the chieftains realized that the unequal struggle would profit them nothing. A stand here would end in futile sacrifice. Clearly they had been deceived regarding the numbers and situation of the Aranites at the rock. It was best to head into the hills and continue the fight another day. The warriors needed no encouragement. Each one headed in his own direction as swiftly as he could go, leaving behind friend or foe. Raelf sounded the charge, but his men were heavier in armor and equipment and could not overhaul the fleeing enemy. He was obliged to halt the pursuit and send flights of arrows after the running Tyndall. It had been a grim victory. Too many of these soldiers had been struck down. Too many enemies had escaped. The primary goal had been achieved, however. Rosfarron was blockaded and threatened no longer. The Moundsman force was defeated. Evrain did not wake till the noon watch was half spent. Before opening his eyes, he imagined himself back on board, for certainly he still felt the swaying of the bunk beneath him, and heard the creaking of the timbers as they labored through the heavy swell. Then he remembered the arrival of the night before. Opening his eyes, he stared about him in puzzlement. He was in a guest room in the fortress on Aaron Rock. Nothing moved except the tiny motes of dust dancing in sunbeams that fell through the shutters. Evrain stretched out his arms and legs. Though he loved the sea, it was good to be on shore again. The discomforts and dangers of war were behind him for the moment. It was almost as pleasant as being home in Kale. Slowly he drifted back into the warm embrace of sleep. A sharp knock on the door brought him back to reality. An apologetic servant peered in. The king was expecting his captain at luncheon within the hour. Lord Karth and the Inrothians would be in attendance. Could he bring warm water for Evrain's bath? Evrain sighed and nodded. The next round was about to begin. He believed it would be much less disconcerting than what had transpired hitherto, though he would admit to being nervous about the encounter with the Lord of Heron Inrath. The old man of the Witch Isle was a legend, the embodiment of terror for wayward children, and sailors who would dare to venture into the foggy reaches of the Witch Sea. Most Aaronites doubted his existence. Too many tall tales had been spun around him. Now the legend had gained substance, and one could only speculate about which of those stories had their roots in the truth. Evrain dressed with care. The colors of the king was also those of his house, black hose and doublet and an emerald green sleeveless surcoat with a pale yellow staked cross emblazoned on it. To fit his rank, 3 smaller crosses replaced the single one on the front and back of his surcoat. A badge of the same design had been sewn onto the right thigh of his hose. It was visible below the jagged edge of the upper garment. He decided against wearing a weapon on his hip. The simple black girdle with silver clasp would do. At last he waved away the servant. All the fuss had brought on a healthy appetite. Ranald was already seated at the long table in the dining hall. The chamberlain seemed relieved when Evrain finally appeared and scurried into the hall to announce him. As soon as his name was called, he stepped through the doorway and bowed low. Ranald's voice reached out to him.
Cousin, a good morning to you. You almost had a start without you.
Evrain rose up smiling. He was suddenly aware of the other men in the room. All the eyes had turned on him.
Good morning, sire. The soft beds in the rock have beguiled me exceedingly. The ship's bunk makes for shorter hours of repose.
Ranald smiled back at him.
And that it does, no doubt.
The easy familiarity was not wasted on the other guests. Earl Wayne was among them, he noticed, and several nobles and captains from the host. Ranald waved an arm to an empty seat at his right side.
Well, sit yourself down, man, before our visitors faint with hunger.
The Enrathians were placed to the king's left. Evrain felt a chill pass through him at the sight of them. The gray-headed old one sat next to Ranald. This was the infamous Karth, the legend, in the flesh. The man's eyes, like amber lamps, fixed their solemn gaze on him, as if his most secret thought was visible. Quickly, Evrain looked away to hide his unease, and found familiar faces. Hunnick and Beor, dressed in black from head to toe, a single silver arrow lay slanted across their chests. There was recognition in their eyes, appreciation too. It set his mind at ease again. There was no threat here. What unfathomable potency this strange man commanded was not set against the people of Arran. Evrain smiled at this thought. Perhaps he wanted it to be true and would willingly ignore any other possibility. He passed them on the way to his seat. The strange notions disappeared as first Beor, then Hunnick gripped his hand. They had not forgotten that moment on Heron Inrath, when trapped and worn out, an unexpected deliverance had arrived in the form of the Aranite fishing fleet. Actions rather than words had bound them into comrades. Even before he had seated himself, the servants rushed in with steaming dishes. Apparently, everyone had waited for his arrival. Instead of being embarrassed, Evrain found that he enjoyed the moment of importance. He also enjoyed the repast. It was amazing what the cooks had been able to rustle up so shortly after the investment of and terrific assault on the rock. There was little conversation at first. The hosts and guests alike seemed famished enough to content themselves with the excellent meal. Evrain did not miss, however, the nervousness in the demeanor of the Aranites, the overly loud and jovial voices and gestures, the willingness to laugh uproariously at the least pleasantry. 2 of the men at their table this day were Viran. The third was not supposed to exist. One did not entertain the enemies and dark threats of yesterday in one's stronghold without some measure of fear or caution. Evrain noticed that the Viran wore their blades on their hips. He told himself that he would have done the same in their position. It only made sense. There was nothing sinister about it. The long cycles of unending war had twisted his thoughts into constant suspicion. Towards the end of the meal, he found the amber eyes resting on him. There was no penetrating stare this time, only a mildly curious expression. At last, the old one addressed him directly.
Captain Evrain, I am glad to make your acquaintance finally.
I have heard much about you. Evrain smiled, suddenly at his ease.
Good things, I hope.
Garth's bearded face lost its solemn aspect. The best things. The very best. There was an intensity in the eyes now, an undisguised appreciation. Evrain remembered the watchers, the guards, their close escape from the cells beneath the mounds.
Lord Garth, I believe I owe you my life. Your men ensured my safety on more than one occasion. I thank you for it.
That may be true, but you would never have needed them had you not volunteered to protect an enemy child from harm. It is more fitting that I thank you for saving that life. Your instinctive decision, so far removed from what your reason and conditioning demanded, has already borne such fruits as could turn the tide for all. Evrain was more than a little astonished at this declaration. It was clear that every word was meant. The life he had chosen not to destroy. What a change had been wrought in the attitudes of so many by the visit of that one child. How the simple decision had brought relief to his own troubled mind. He wondered where Gareth was. Would the boy not have been in Lord Garth's company?
How fares Gareth?
There was a hesitation, an instant of painful reflection. He was taken by Malik's men, taken to Lakeside. Ranald looked up sharply at this. Evrain felt the blood drain from his face in a painful rush. He struggled to get out his next words.
Is he dead?
The old man slowly shook his head. Someone has gone back to find him. All our hopes for the boy's deliverance ride with him. Could it be possible that there was fear behind these words? Evrain had the strong impression that the man before him would not know the meaning of fear, but rather inspired it in others. Ranald asked,
Would Lord Malik not bargain for his life? Would he receive a ransom for the boy? I know Fengor would not buy him back, but we could arrange.
Garth was shaking his head. Malik does not know he has the prince, or Gareth would be dead by now, worse than dead. Fengor would not buy him because he is not Fengor's son. His expression changed abruptly. He looked at the men in front of him as if a monumental decision had been made. King Ranald, Captain Evrain, it is time to reveal all secrets. If we cannot trust one another at this very hour, we will fall to the Shadow Lord within the season. That is why I aided you against the barbarian invasion. It was an attempt to purchase your trust. At least it has earned me the opportunity to sit at your table and be heard. All those present had ceased their conversations. Their eyes were fixed on the old one. Hunnick and Beor shifted nervously. Garth continued. While we strove against the Southland Alliance headed by Horan Imranag, god king of the Gudrid Empire, and his Giri vassals, Malik Julian has initiated the most devastating swarm of all the ages of Myril on the eastern shore of the inland sea. Fenvale has breached its sea walls and flooded all its fields. Lysan was swept away in days. Ligurium may not exist anymore. Nuria itself is fighting for survival. In the swamps of Darallan, he has assembled these forces, irresistible in numbers and power, to complete the annihilation of his arch-nemesis, the Viran. For the children of Vir he has only death. For any other nation willing to bow to him, enslavement. He will remake the inland sea region in his image, gathering power unto himself, fortifying his position against me. The Aaronites and Viran alike were staring at him with wide-eyed wonderment. It seemed to all that the room had grown darker. The sun had surrendered some of its warmth. Ranald raised a puzzled voice.
Against you? Why?
Garth turned tired eyes on him. I am his ultimate opponent, the one he was brought here to overcome. He has no other conviction as strong, no other goal as urgent. That is why he has plotted all these many cycles, since before the summoning, long before, to achieve my downfall and destruction. That is why he has twisted nature into perversions such as Lord Rune witnessed, keeping them out of sight, increasing their potency, until this hour. He believes himself strong enough at last to crush me and the people I favored, and there was little I could do to counter his scheming. The summoning destroyed my credibility. All the events of those dark cycles have undone the unassailable position of the Viron. They emerged from the long strife, at war with their closest ally, Aaron. The art that sets them apart and makes them such dangerous adversaries was banned, and the blame was mine alone, even if the Aaronite prince and his men were massacred by Tuer hordes, even if the art was not used by any Viron for the summoning. There was a sharp intake of breath at these statements. The Aaronites looked at one another in shock and distrust. Ranald's eyes had narrowed. His voice dropped a stone into the suspicious silence.
What you say, Lord Karth, goes against the accepted truth here in Aaron. For 600 cycles it has been believed that the Viron did the killing on that fateful day. King Gervain's heir and all his 3,000 men were slaughtered as they emerged from your port of Vale. This was the work of our so-called allies, the Viron. How is it that you come to hold a different view on the matter? Is there proof you could offer for what you claim?
Karth's face was a mask of resignation. No, there is no proof to offer after all this time, unless we could drag in that great traitor and have him confess to his crimes. There is only my testimony as one who was there, the testimony of a criminal, who in desperation, pride, and folly committed his crimes, and has lived with them these last hundreds of cycles. Allow me to say this much. I performed the unthinkable, the horrible, but I did it in the open, without deceit or pretense. My testimony I offer you today, since I could not find an opportunity to offer it to your forebears. And if you choose to disbelieve it, you have the right, since it is the testimony of one you have been taught to despise and hate, the testimony of Kael the Summoner. No one moved at first. Outside the doorway could be heard a collective gasp from hidden listeners. Ranald was too shocked to be annoyed by this flagrant disregard from his servants. After all, the words had not been said behind closed doors in an inner council chamber. Such damning, profound confession had been made in the banquet hall, as if it had no more significance than the changing weather. Still, every soul present there felt the impact of it, even greater than the epic battles against the Amul and their allies, the terrific struggle and the victory gained. The past in all its appalling magnitude confronted them then and there in the form of this mythical figure seated next to the king. The ingrained suspicions, filled with swords and treachery, rose on every side, till reason and understanding wavered in the face of overpowering fear. It was their lot to face this day, this crisis, to make an impossible decision. Ranald spoke the words they could not formulate.
If what you say is true, then Malik Yulian is the liar, and all we have believed for so long and fought this cursed war over for all this time is false. You are the summoner.
The word fell into the void between them. Its incantation alone was enough to set the testimony at naught, to vilify and condemn without thought or sober judgment. The king continued.
I may be the fool in this case, but I am not so blind as to make my decisions without weighing every truth. You will forgive me, Lord Karth, if I take a little while to consider this. I do wish to continue this conversation on the morrow. There are many questions.
His voice trailed off. It was stupefying to have this monster, this impossibly potent threat at his very table. The endless feuding and hatred, the uncountable lives lost, the ages of violence and suffering. Could the blame all be heaped on one head? There were too many aspects to consider. He had never before entertained the possibility that the evil Kael was not guilty of all the accusations leveled at him. Yet the suggestion of another manipulating hand had recently gained more substance. There was no doubt that Malik Yulian was the Horan Imranag behind the barbarian invasion. He was actively conspiring to bring about the destruction of Aaron, and if he was doing it now, he could certainly have done it before.